Andy Verity. Now, yesterday we reported that the average pay deal in the private sector in 2010 was 2% and in the public sector just 0.75%. And that despite RPI inflation currently running at 4.7%. Well, did that get you going? The story sent the text console into meltdown. Here's what you told us.
My name is Neil. I'm a college lecturer in further education. Although we are lucky to have kept our jobs, and myself included, we were initially promised a 0.2% pay rise, but then just before Christmas we learned that that wasn't going to be the case.
I work in the security industry and we haven't had a pay rise for 3 years now.
Employed as a HGV driver delivering to supermarkets. I haven't had a pay rise since April 2008 and I feel very frustrated.
I'm Dave from Coventry. I'm a design engineer. Part of the 3-year deal, we had 2% plus RPI, so this year it was the equivalent of 7%.
A lorry driver from Rugby, 3 years of pay freezes, the back end of last year, 1.5% take it or leave it offer. It absolutely stinks.
Yeah, keep those texts coming in on 85058. We'd like to hear exactly what you've suffered or indeed are enjoying in terms of any pay movements. But many of you told us you didn't have a pay rise at all last year. Some, like that lorry driver from Rugby, haven't had one for several years, as we've been hearing. Only a handful had a proper rise, and only one or two suffered a pay cut. This isn't, of course, a statistical sample, but what it suggests is that pay hasn't been keeping up with inflation for a good while, and that people's living standards are indeed falling. It also supports what a lot of experts have been saying, that on average people were getting better off when the UK was officially in recession, whereas now in the recovery their income buys them less.
But not if you're one of the bankers, who continue to do very nicely, it seems. The BBC's Robert Peston today reports that UK banks have defied the politicians and are set to pay out billions in bonuses over the next few weeks. They're even bumping up base salaries in a bid to avoid new tough bonus rules in the future. Where does this all leave us? Have things really got worse than last year when the economy was still in a slump? And where does the city bonus season leave the government's claim that we're all in this together? Let's talk to Jonathan Davis, who's an economist and investment advisor, first of all. Jonathan, what does what we've been hearing from our listeners and the data on pay tell us about what's been happening to our personal finances?
In the recession, as the piece said, we didn't really feel the recession because pay was broadly flat or slightly rising, and of course mortgage costs were slashed because the Bank of England reduced interest rates from 5% to 0.5%, so that really helped things. But in the very mild recovery, things have got really, really difficult. Mortgage costs have slightly edged up. Pay clearly is significantly below inflation. Unemployment's rising. So it's very interesting that in the recovery, this is when it's starting to hurt.
Why do you think it is that pay settlements are so poor, even in the private sector?
Well, I think it's symptomatic of the fact, as I see it, that the economy is so dire. Government debt is beyond belief. Household debt is beyond belief. Banks are holding terrible bad debts on their books. Unemployment's rising. The public sector is being hammered.
On the
House
other
prices
hand,
are falling.
It's really
difficult.
But a lot of profits in companies are going up. You know, they're often paying higher dividends. We've seen share prices rise.
Yes, I believe that's symptomatic of the bailout of the banks a couple of years ago and the massive boost to the economy from the slashing of interest rates and the money printing that Bank of England went under. However, I don't think that that's a true reflection of what's actually happening in the economy. The fact is that people's debt levels are still gargantuan. House prices are falling. Unemployment's rising. The outlook for the economy, I would suggest, is still very fragile at best, if not dire, simply because of all the debt still in society.
OK, well, just focusing on pay, John Philpott's with us. He's Chief Economist at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. I mean, for example, in that collection of listeners we were listening to there, John, Neil, who works in higher education, hasn't had a pay rise, counts himself lucky because at least he has a job, and some of his colleagues have lost theirs. Now, that's the atmosphere, isn't it, that surrounds a lot of these pay settlements and perhaps goes some way to explaining why it's lagging inflation.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, of course, employers ultimately will only pay what they need to either recruit, retain or motivate staff. And at present, the labour market overall is very slack, and so there's less pressure to raise wages. And of course, in the public sector, as a sort of result of the fiscal squeeze, we've seen initially pay being curbed. This year we're going to be seeing jobs cut as well, and the overall environment is one that suggests that pay rises will be relatively modest.
Another listener there, Dave from Coventry, he got lucky, he says, with a 3-year pay deal linked to RPI. So he really is keeping up with inflation. A lot of people in that boat with 3-year deals. It's a bit of a gamble, isn't it? Because are there many deals like that in the private sector?
Yeah, there have been. Of course, a lot of them were renegotiated in one way or another to avoid job losses during the very sort of height of the recession, because a lot of people thought it was better to keep their job than stick with the deal. And of course, manufacturing that got hit particularly badly in that way could actually be one of the sectors where we see sort of relatively strong pay growth this year, because we've seen that sector improving. It's really going to be in the public sector where we're seeing cuts that there's going to be constraints, and of course in many parts of the private sector serving consumer markets where we've seen the big VAT increase this year, they're going to be reluctant to offer big pay increases either.
Jonathan Davis, families are being squeezed at both ends, aren't they? For people in work, portrayed as the lucky ones, are facing rising prices. We've heard a lot about that, but a couple of the listeners who texted in mentioned that they've also had a pay freeze. In fact, Joy says not only has she had a pay freeze, a share scheme has gone, pension contributions have gone up. She also says, of course, inflation's going up. So it was a double, triple whammy for a lot of people.
I think people need to get real, as far as I see, we're looking at potentially a 20-year depression in the UK. I refer you to Japan. They're 20 years in depression and counting, because our governments, successive governments, are doing pretty well exactly the same things as Japan has done since 1989. So in essence, in order for people to have hope, what they have to do is essentially do anything they possibly can to retain their income, because as soon as they lose their income, they're going to find things unbelievably difficult.
Interesting text here from Nick in Devon. He says, I was 30% better off in the recession, Jonathan. We had a 4-month shutdown at Honda. Yep. He says, I live in Devon and lodge in Swindon I live in Devon and lodge in Swindon during the week and travel home at weekends, pumping fuel into the car. So I was saving £400 a month, and that's the point, isn't it? It's the outputs, John Philpott, that people aren't making up for with their pay.
Well, that's right. I mean, we've seen this week as well increases in rail fares. That has a big impact. We know sort of fuel prices are going up. I mean, ironically, we recently had these comments saying that we'd never had it so good. I mean, it was arguable that for some people that may have been true during the recession, but it's certainly not going to be true this year. And I think in some respects this year may feel more like a year of tough times than the recession actually did.
That was Lord Young, wasn't it? He's no longer in his job, it has to be said. But I want to go back very briefly, if I can, to this depression point of view. What's the panacea to this?
The fact that the government and the Bank of England thinks that in effect the only solution is to continue to print money. Okay, they're not doing so just now, but I've every expectation that they will do so in advance of the next election. All that does is give a short-term unrealistic boost to the economy and makes people believe that the economy is getting sorted. Well, it's not. The result is that we have higher unemployment, lower public sector employment, higher taxes, higher indirect taxes, VAT, tuition fees, you name it, and these are all deflationary in the system. Add to that falling house prices, add to that huge
they're making people better off, aren't they, Jonathan? Falling house prices.
Oh, indeed. The problem is, though, 70% of the population are involved in housing.
OK, just to bring in a few more texts here. As an architect in the private sector, I've taken a 40% pay cut, this text says. This is very typical for those in the profession that are still in work. There are different pictures, John Philpott, aren't there, in different segments of industry. Why about... there's one here from a crane driver who says that I've had £1 taken off my headline rate, my hourly rate, to be reviewed every 6 months, and I haven't had a pay rise in 3 years. Construction's supposed to be doing well, isn't it?
Well, funnily enough, construction, was doing quite well, but if you look at the official pay stats, construction's one of the sectors where we've seen real earnings, or at least sort of average earnings, falling, even in the last year. So, the situation isn't good there, and I think given the public sector cutbacks, construction's going to take a further hit.
OK, just a question for both of you. Given all this, there's nothing wrong with those bankers' bonuses, are there? We need to pay them in order to keep them in the country.
In my own view, I know it's controversial. I wouldn't have bailed out the banks to the extent that they did. The fact is, the bankers are laughing their way to the bank.
John Philpott?
I think I'd be tempted to call their bluff, because there is the risk that we'll sort of lose them and actually, be shooting ourselves in the foot. I think, ultimately the solution to this is going to have to be at an international level, but that seems extremely difficult to achieve.
OK, well, we'll be talking about what those bankers are spending their bonuses on later in the programme when we talk about luxury boats. Thank you, though, Jonathan Davis and John Philpott. It's 5:46.
On DAB Digital.